The first obstacle to effective reading is really lack of education. Lack of education, and I have to really repeat this lack of education, because so many people come to me after I give a presentation on stage, and they pull me off to a corner and say that they're very embarrassed, that they'll have situations where even they're reading to their children, putting them to sleep at night, and they honestly can't remember a lot about what they read. And so many people tie their reading abilities to their intelligence. And I always tell people that intelligence, specifically here, I'm not talking about the noun about a thing. I'm talking about something you do. And reading is something you do, and you're not born with the ability to read, right? You weren't born and all of a sudden come out of the womb and then go out to the delivery room, waiting room, and just pick up a magazine and start reading. Of course not. Reading is something that we're taught, but how do you improve your reading? It's not just through practice. It's also through the correct practice, because the challenge is like back in school, I was a very strong typer, and it's because growing up, family had like one of those really old typewriters, not plug-in electric, or not a computer. It was like this old dusty typewriter, and I would entertain myself. I would just use start typing on it, and I invented this technique called the two-finger method. Right, the two-finger method, and it's probably pretty popular. But when we got in school, around 11, 12, 13 years old in junior high school, I took a class called typing, and it was a room full of people. And at the first week, they just let you just play with the typewriter, and I would start typing. And when they rated on how well everyone was doing and how fast everyone was doing, it was really great, because I was one of the top typers in the class. In fact, I was the top typer in the class, and it was great. They would put your name on the blackboard. Before they had whiteboards, they had these blackboards, and it would be like Jim Quick, and that's it's like, wow, Jim Quick, and quick typer. But here's the thing. A week later, the teacher stands in front of the room and says, "Okay, enough just playing around with the typewriter. I want to show you how to type." And I was thinking in my mind, "Wow, I could teach this class. I could show you how to type using my two-finger method, using my index fingers." And the teacher said, "No, no, no. I'm gonna show you how to do it correctly, and you're gonna use all your fingers, and you're gonna here are what they call your home keys." And here, and we start typing, and what do you think happened to my typing speed? It went down. It went down horribly. And after trying it, and it felt a little frustrating, it felt a little different, it felt awkward, honestly. So what do I naturally go back to do? I go back to my two fingers, right? And so, but the other students who didn't have the habit of using two fingers, they actually started typing the way the teacher started to type. And after a week, a funny thing started to happen. They would, at the end of class, you would start putting your scores and your words per minute on the blackboard, and I start to fall in terms of my rank. I became, someone out typed me, and then I was second and third and fourth and fifth. And then after a week of doing this, most of the class was typing much faster than I was, and it took my slow brain days to figure out that, hey, that's unfair. They're using 5 times more fingers, so I have to work 5 times harder using two fingers. And I use this kind of as a story to compare it to reading, is that a lot of people are reading with their two fingers, because they were never shown on how to use all their other fingers. And think about it. When's the last time you took a class called reading? Not like a college lit class, but a class actually entitled reading. You're probably 6, 7, 8 years old. Now, let me ask you a question. Has the volume of what you need to read increased a little bit since you're 8 years old? Has the difficulty increased a little bit or a lot since you're 8 years old? So the challenge is, a lot of people think that as you grow older, your reading speed starts to increase, and it does a little bit, but it certainly levels off, because how we read most things is how we read them back when we were back in grade school. It's the equivalent of, if you never learned how to type, typing with two fingers. All right, so we're going to give you the new education here. The second obstacle to effective reading, what gets in the way of your reading speed and your reading comprehension, is lack of focus. lack of focus. And this is probably, I see you smiling because this is probably something that a lot of people struggle with. And I could tell you, going through and working with as many people as we do, have you ever had the experience of reading something and then just getting distracted? That you read a page in a book again and forget what you just read, and you reread it and you still don't know what you read. And or maybe that, if you don't distract yourself outside, you start to distract yourself inside and you start to daydream. And so I'll give you a couple of thoughts on focus, barring anything that's biochemical or physiological or genetic. Okay, a lot of focus issues seem to stem, in my experience from talking to people, is not from reading speed, like fast. It's actually reading too slow. And let me say that, there's a rumor out there, and I don't know if it's spread around by slow readers, that if you increase your reading speed, your comprehension will go down. And what I'm here to say is that in actuality, increasing your reading speed in a lot of cases could actually improve your reading comprehension because it improves your focus. Let me give you an example. We talk about your brain being the most powerful supercomputer on the planet. Yet when we read something, we feed it one word at a time. Metaphorically, we're starving our brain. Our brain, which we use such a small percentage of it, it can make so many different calculations consciously and unconsciously. Yet when we're reading, we read so slow because that's how we were educated. And so if we don't give our brain the stimulus it needs, it'll seek stimulus elsewhere. It'll seek entertainment elsewhere in the form of distraction. Let me say that again. If you don't read fast enough and give your mind the stimulus it needs, it'll entertain itself by mind wandering, by distracting itself in the environment. Like, how many people know somebody, maybe it's you, that needs the music playing in the background or the television playing in the background because your mind needs to be entertained. Or if it doesn't entertain itself outside, it starts to distract itself inside. You start to daydream about your job, about work, about clients, about the family, about a vacation. Your mind starts to fantasize, and that's really your right brain getting engaged in reading. As you'll see, in this session and the next, a lot of reading is a very left brain process. And, few percentage of people who are reading actually employ the power of the right brain, which is the storehouse of creativity, of visualization, of imagination. And your mind is going to be used, it's going to be active one way or another. And if we don't activate it through what's directly focused on, it's going to, again, do it in other ways that might not be in the best interest of us getting the result that we're looking for. And so, when I'm talking about reading speed, when you're reading so slow, the metaphor that I would use is kind of like driving. When you're driving down the street, in your neighborhood that you've done thousands of times before, and you're maybe going 20 or 30 miles an hour, are you really focused on the act of driving? I mean, are you really thinking about how you're driving? Probably not, right? And so, the reason is because you've done it so much and you're going so slow, you don't need to focus on it, right? What are you doing? You're listening to the radio, you're talking on your cell phone, you're eating something, you're drinking your coffee, you're daydreaming about, did I pick up the dry cleaners? But here's the other example. Let's say you're not going through your neighborhood at 20 or 30 miles an hour. Let's say instead you're going on a straightaway in a race car. You're racing down a track and taking hairpin turns at 100 miles an hour. Are you having more or less focus? A little bit or a lot more focus? A lot more focus, right? You're not thinking about what you want to eat later in the day or whether or not you picked up the dry cleaning. You're 100% focused on what's in front of you and the actual act that you're engaged with. And that's very similar to reading, isn't it? That if you're going faster, you're going to be more focused on what's in front of you because you don't have the time or the inclination or the concentration, the bandwidth to even focus on things that do not serve you. Okay, so one of the obstacles to effective reading is lack of focus, and a lot of lack of focus comes from is just reading too slowly. Because I want to take care of that myth, because I'm going to give you real strategies and techniques to read it faster. But if you have a belief that if you read faster, that your comprehension and focus will go down, then it won't serve you. Okay, the third obstacle to effective reading is something called sub-vocalization. Subvocalization. And what does it mean? I mean, do you notice when you're looking at this screen, when you're saying 5 obstacles to effective reading, you notice when you're reading something, you hear that inner voice reading along with you? Hopefully it's your own voice. It's not like somebody else's or multiple voices. That's your subvocalization. Subvocalizing is the process of saying the words inside your mind, right? It's vocal, meaning speech, sub, like inner or under, like a submarine. It's your inner speech. And why is it an obstacle to effective reading? Well, simply because if you have to say the words in order to understand what you're reading, then you can only read as fast as you can speak. Let me say that again in another way. If you have to say all the words out loud or inside your mind as you read, your reading speed is limited to your talking speed and not your thinking speed. Now, here's the thing. Do you need to say the words inside your mind in order to understand the words? Like if I had a word like computer on the screen here, or reading on the screen here like you see now, or learning, do you have to say the word learning in order to understand it? No, right? Because most words, 80, 90, 95% of all the words that you need to read on your day to day are what they call sight words. Sight words. These are words you know by sight because you've seen them thousands of times and you don't have to pronounce those words anymore. It's just like the sign that I showed you a little while ago, right? It's a red sign, it has 8 sides, stop. I guarantee you, very rarely do you say the word stop to yourself as you're driving, right? As you're going through your day, you see these signs, throughout the day, like in those, you don't need to pronounce the words to understand them, right? Because you could automatically see it, get a picture, and a picture is worth what? 1,000 words. Okay, so subvocalization is a challenge, and we find that the naturally gifted readers, the ones that learn that maybe either learned it correctly or was just naturally gifted, if there is such a thing, is that they don't spend the time as much subvocalizing a lot of the words, especially the filler words, the, theirs, this, us, like a lot of the words that are used, ands, and so on. So part of what this program is about is just reducing the subvocalization, and you will never get rid of the subvocalization totally. You still need to pronounce words, because, phonetically, you want to be able to pronounce it, especially depending on what you're reading. If you're reading poetry or prose, sometimes you want to read something because you want to hear, the subvocalization inside of you. You want to hear the voices. So again, all reading is context dependent depending what your outcome is. The 4th obstacle to effective reading is something called regression. And regression, this is something that we want to put an end to, or definitely dramatically reduce in this program. As a quick reader, you want to spend less time regressing. And what's regressing? It's kind of like back skipping. Have you ever read something, found yourself going back and rereading those same words, or you're reading something and say, hey, that just happened, and because you accidentally, unconsciously, without your conscious awareness, reread a whole line in a book. And regression is that process. And reading specialists saying 10% or 20% of your time or more could be spent in the act of unconsciously, within your unawareness, actually rereading whole words or sentences. But here's a question: does that really help you to understand more? Let's say we're in a room together and we're watching your favorite movie that you've really been looking forward to, and yet there's somebody in the corner there with a remote control, and every 30 seconds they just rewind a little bit, a little bit, a little bit, a little bit. Does that really what do you want to do to that person besides kick them out of the room and take the remote control, right? Is it really helping you get more of the comprehension of that movie? Of course not, right? Because what it's doing is it's breaking up the natural rhythm and the flow of your reading. A lot of times when people read faster, they could actually get the idea faster because they're closing and getting closure on that sentence. So sometimes reading faster actually helps you to have better comprehension because it gives you the context of what you're reading faster. But certainly going back and rereading words is not going to help you to be able to do that, because it's just breaking up the natural rhythm and the flow of the actual process. So regression is something that we're going to help you to greatly reduce. And the fifth obstacle to effective reading, I'm going to say, is limiting beliefs. Limiting beliefs. And I have to put it there because I still believe that, I still believe about beliefs, is that 80% of success is still psychological. That all behavior is belief driven. All behavior is belief driven. Because in order to be able to do something, create a result, you need to be able to do a behavior, right? If I want to get a result in life, I need to be able to do something. But in order to do that behavior, I also need a belief that enables that behavior to be done. A belief is kind of like setting a thermostat. It's where you're setting like the goal where it's like, whereas a thermometer is kind of reacting to its environment, right? Like it's reacting to the temperature, the temperament of the environment. It reacts, the thermometer does. A thermostat is something that you set, and by the nature of setting that thermostat, it changes its environment. And that's what I want to encourage all of you quick learners to be able to do, and do more often in the areas that you're not doing it. Because in some areas you're doing extraordinarily well, where you're setting a standard, a thermostat very high, and you're creating that environment around you. Other people are letting their thermostat being set unconsciously. It's being set by the environment, or maybe it was set at a very early age. You have a thermostat set at how much you're worth financially. A thermostat set about how much you're worth in a relationship or in your health, and then unconsciously, which some learning researchers find that most of it's actually going on in your conscious mind, right? Most of the stuff that you learned, you didn't consciously go to school to learn. It came through experiential, came through your other than conscious mind, where you learn most of the things. Like, think about how many songs that you know. Think about how many songs or lyrics to music that you know, and how many of those did you actually study, right? Because you didn't actually study, you learned it unconsciously. And so beliefs, when we're talking about beliefs, literally all behavior is belief driven. When you're talking about, and some of the visualization exercises that we do in the memory training program, it's what leaders do. It's like what athletes do. Like Roger Bannister in 1954, what is he famous for? Breaking the 4-minute mile, right? And if you watch interviews, you find out that, or read interviews, you find out that he did it by visualizing himself crossing the finish line and looking at the clock, and it says 3:59, because he knew what all leaders knew, all creators knew, all innovators knew, that it has to happen inside your mind, and I'm pointing to my mind right now, before it happens outside. That leadership, part of leadership, or the part of the act of creation, is taking the invisible and making it visible. But your mind doesn't know the difference between something you vividly imagine and something that's real. That Einstein said imagination is more powerful than knowledge. And it's not just that. It's also, it's not just athletes, right? Leaders of companies do it. Disney. We used that. We mentioned Disney's quote. He would look out at an orange orchard and say, that's where the Magic Kingdom's going to be. That's where the castle's going to be. That's where Tomorrowland's going to be. And he would do that, and because he knew he'd had to see it inside of his mind. There's stories about him taking out potential team members out there and saying, hey, can you see that? And for those people who couldn't see it, he wouldn't hire them. Because all behavior is belief driven, and it all stems inside your mind first, inside your imagination. Okay, so let's now that we've covered the 5 obstacles to reading, I wanna share with you what I think the 5 pillars of quick reading are. The 5 P's, if you will, the 5 pillars to quick reading. All right, and I'm going to break it down into the 5 categories, and they each start with the letter P. For a mnemonic device, if you will. And the first pillar is place. All right, the place, because certainly your environment that you're reading is going to have an effect on how you learn and how well you learn. Certainly, if you had a book in a very noisy environment, let's say you're at a sporting event, or you're in the middle of a battle or a war, or you're kind of floating out in the desert or in the ocean. Certainly, the place could have an effect on your ability to read and retain and focus. Okay, so we're going to talk about the first P, which is place. The second P I'm going to talk about is your physiology, really, and that's really the what. The physiology is it's a fancy word for your body, how you're using your physical body. including your posture and how you're breathing and such. So that's going to be your second P. The third P I'm going to talk about is your psychology. Where physiology is really your body, your psychology is your mind. And a lot of psychology has to do with motivation and motivational strategies, why you're learning something and really your attitude. And so psychology is going to be your third P. Now, the fourth P I call your procedure. And your procedure really is the how. I'm going to give you in this quick learning program, in this quick reading program, just like I give in the quick recall program. In the quick recall program, there's dozens of different tips and techniques on how to be able to read more, be able to retain more in less time. Names and faces, client information, giving speeches without notes, foreign languages, and passcodes and numbers and everything. Those are the procedures. Those are the step-by-step strategies on how to learn something. And here I'm going to give you the procedures for quick reading. How to have better focus. I'm going to give you procedures, step-by-step processes on how to retain more and comprehend more of what you read. All right, and that's really a lot of the content that we're going to talk about. So the fourth P is procedure. And the fifth P is really the practice, because practice makes progress. Or another way of saying it is practice makes permanent. The practice is where the rubber meets the road, because you can learn how to do it, but until you practice it and make it a habit, it's not going to hold and it's not going to stick. And so the practice really is the when. Been really talking about how long to practice, when to practice, and how often to practice. And that's what we're going to talk about, so we can make your quick reading ability a habit. Because one of the questions that we get, people have gone through speed reading programs, they say that, well, I learned it, I was able to do it well, but then I lost it. And I guess coming back to the metaphor of learning how to drive and be able to do it unconsciously to the point where you could kind of show up at work or show up at home and you don't even remember the trip there, that's where we want to get you to the point of. And and really where that comes from is through practice. It's just like learning how to type. Once you learn how to type, do you lose the ability to type? No, it's like the ability to be able to ride a bicycle. But just like when we're talking about the golf clubs, you have variance, you have variable, you could always go back and type with two fingers. Let me say it again. You could always go back and read the way you were reading before this program started. But once you learn this and you go through it, over the spaced repetition that I'm going to show you on how to develop a new habit in this program, then you could always do the opposite and read faster. Okay, so these are the five pillars, and let's get to it. Place. Okay, this is where you're learning, and what this is now. This is under optimal learning conditions. Okay, so I'm going to show you what would be optimal, and you always start from there. And under conditions like where you're learning, and you're reading in the train, you tailor it as best your ability. All right, so you want to create your optimal learning environment. And your optimal learning environment is especially the place, in your home or in your office where you go there to study. You go there to learn. It's ideally not in your bedroom, where you're applying this. Is ideally not in the place, where you're entertaining or watching television, but you have a really dedicated place where you're learning. And literally what it's doing is it's training your nervous system, training your neurology, if you will, to be able to put yourself in that state every single time you're in that environment. It's kind of like when people go to the gym or an athlete goes on the field, that environment becomes associated, or another word for associated is anchored to that state. Okay, so going back, and we'll cover this in the psychology coming up, all learning is state dependent. You have a certain emotion or a certain state of mind, a state of emotion that you get in when you're when you're confident, or you feel strong, and this is where you're looking to anchor yourself in this environment. Okay, and what does that involve? It involves